we're going to start our second panel. And I think we've started really strong, so I've got hope for the second panel as well. No pressure. I'm going to invite the moderator, Dr. Jamie Hockin, who is going to be moderating this panel. Dr. Jamie Hockin was actually a doctor who was sent to Macedonia to work in the refugee camps as well. So as well as moderating the panel, he has some insights that he can offer, and much like Mike Ward, he will take part in the question and answer period as well. So welcome, Dr. Jamie Hockin.
Thank you, Karnara. It's a great opportunity to be here. I had a very small role to play on the ground in Macedonia, and you might wonder why a Health Canada physician is standing here amongst all the immigration and folks. But Health Canada was one agency playing a role among many other agencies of the federal government to plan the arrival of what we were told was an unknown number of refugees from Kosovo. Our focus was on communicable disease surveillance and health needs in general. And I had, at the time, I was dealing with communicable disease surveillance programs in Canada. I was also running the field epidemiology training program, which took, at that time, mostly physicians into a 2-year apprenticeship so they could learn some real on-the-ground public health. And my program's contribution was to send field epidemiologists to one to Skopje, one to Greenwood, Nova Scotia, to help with the arrival of refugees, and one to Trenton. We replaced Doug Manuel in Skopje with me. I was not getting to do a lot of field work at the time, but it was quite a treat to be able to go, and quite moving to be welcomed so warmly by the immigration and foreign affairs folks in Skopje, even though I was only really working with them for about half a day on the days when there were flights to Canada. The rest of my time I was working with a multinational group led by the UNHCR to try to assess the needs of refugees who were with host families in Macedonia. So in the first session, we had some of the background leading towards the reality of hundreds of thousands of displaced persons, many of whom showed up in Macedonia. And about half of those were with host families, the other ended up in camps. And our speakers are going to talk about what that meant on the ground in Albania and Macedonia. So we'll start things off with Marilynn Cooper, who I actually worked with on my half days, several days a week, doing the Fit to Fly screening. That's the last stop before refugees got on the bus to go to the airplane. So Marilynn.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to say good morning still, I think. And thank you for Karnara for inviting me to speak at the conference. It gave me the opportunity to review a lot of my memories from 25 years ago, which was wonderful. Now, how did I get to Kosovo and become part of this? I was actually not working at the time, but I had worked for the Citizenship and Immigration Medical Unit prior to this. And in 1999, the spring, when I heard that Citizenship and Immigration and the Government of Canada was planning on bringing refugees to Canada under the Family Reunification Program, I thought, hey, maybe I can help. So I contacted Dr. George Giovanazzo, who was the medical director at Citizenship and Immigration Medical Section at that time, and offered my assistance. George was very fast in replying. He said, yes, absolutely, but we don't want you in Ottawa. Would you be willing to go to Skopje in Macedonia to manage the medical processing there? And little did I realize at that time, by answering in the affirmative, I was going to change the trajectory of my life. When I first got there, everyone here knows the 5,000 refugees that came to Canada under Operation Parasol, but not everyone was aware that there was a family reunification process that was ongoing before Operation Parasol and after Operation Parasol. There was probably several hundred immigrants, or refugees, I should say, that I was dealing with under that program. And these people required the complete Canadian immigration medical examination, which consisted of the history and physical, a chest x-ray for those 11 and over, and a syphilis test for those 15 and over. The Canadian immigration officers would direct actually I should say who undertook this process and who needed it was people who had left Kosovo and were living with friends and family in Macedonia. They had family in Canada who were sponsoring them. So the immigration officers would head out to the hills and find them and sign them a time and place to come and have the medical examination. The medical examination was done at a local hospital by an IOM doctor who was provided to me. And my part in it was he understood the language, so he was able to communicate with the refugees. My part was to review the results of the histories and physicals, the chest x-ray and the blood work, and then pass on those results and the usual classification under the immigration program for the medical exams to the immigration officers. Now, the process changed quickly because about a month after I got there, perhaps only 3 weeks, the family reunification program, Canada announced Operation Parasol. So we had a very abrupt turnaround and went from full medical screenings on persons living outside the camps to a fitness to fly screening on refugees living in the camps. The refugees were not allowed to leave the camps. They couldn't come to the hospital to undertake these a medical exam at all. The fitness to fly exam consisted of a quick review and a blood pressure on adults. These are undertaken by the IOM doctors. You can see the IOM doctor sitting at the desk taking notes down and me supervising. Actually, nobody was coming to me at that time. I had a moment to stand and see what they were up to. Any concerns, let's say most people, the IOM doctor had the ability to say someone was fit to fly. They assigned them a green fit to fly status and directed them to buses that were on the standby waiting to take them to the airport. Anyone that they considered had health problems that we should be aware of directed them to a secondary medical assessment that was being undertaken by Jamie and I in the tent next door. So the medical officers, myself and Jamie, you can see us both there. That's 25 years ago, so maybe you recognize us, perhaps you don't. Along with the translator, of course, we're working in the military field tent. And needless to say, this setup allowed for very little privacy. So we're supposed to be undertaking a secondary medical exam out in the open, in the tent. You can see the family of the person we were discussing crowded around us, and there were other people in the tent. The immigration officers were there. So it was not a private situation. So we did, again, perhaps a little bit more of an examination and assigned the people a status. Now, of the daily assessments that were being done by IOM, it was about 300 or so, and only 20 or 30 were referred to us for our secondary examination. These cases were classified as an orange or red status, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And they were collated by Jamie and I and faxed to the bases in Canada, to the reception centers that people were going to that day. The medical coding that we assessed was determined by the nature of the condition the person had and was either an orange status, which applied to those who required attention by the health staff shortly after arrival in Canada, or a red status that required a more urgent assessment on arrival. Two examples of a red code fitness to fly. One was an elderly female with severe or quite serious congestive heart failure, and the other one was a young female who was well along in her pregnancy, so well along that she would never have been allowed to fly on a commercial flight. And we did have some concerns, but we felt since there was an IOM doctor accompanying the people on their flight, that we would send her away. I'm not sure the IOM doctor was so happy with that decision, but we thought we were okay doing that. Both required hospitalization very shortly after their arrival in Canada, with positive outcomes for both of them, including one new Canadian arrival. Yeah. Was anyone found not fit to fly? It's quite amazing that of 5,000 refugees that passed through the fitness to fly assessment, there's only 2 that I recall that were refused. Both were elderly females who had severe lung problems, and it was believed that the long flight to Canada with the decreased atmospheric pressure on board and decreased oxygen level would have had a detrimental effect on their health, and that they would decompensate during the flight. One of these women was there with her 2 sons and their extended families, because we were moving people in family groups. And when they were advised that mom would not be able to go, both sons and families wanted to stay behind. In a very quick family discussion, they convinced each other to send, I believe, the younger son ahead with his family, whereas the older son stayed with mom in the camps. I'm happy to say there was a happy outcome to this event, because I followed up on the woman and her family a few weeks later and found that they had been accepted to Germany, because it was felt that the 1-hour flight to Germany she would be able to successfully undertake that flight with her family. Okay, so about what it was exhilarating, okay, to do this work, but it was quite exhausting. And we had I returned then to the refugee resettlement program, the family reunification program, but about early in July, the first of the returning flights started after the ending of hostilities in Kosovo. And it was sort of a bittersweet moment to be at the airport on the tarmac, welcoming the first plane load of Kosovars back on their way home to Kosovo. And you can see I'm holding a young baby here who came back with a single mom who was searching for her baggage. The baggage was dropped on the tarmac, and just as a warning to anyone, whoever is involved in one of these mass transportations, please don't give everyone the same bag to come back with. People really, they had to really spend a lot of time looking for their bags. Okay, post-operation Parasol, I returned to the family reunification program at the local hospital. And this continued for about another 2 months with myself in attendance, the local IOM doctor there. And about the middle of August, things started to slow down. It was more difficult to find people who were still out and living in the community and required this medical examination. So the program was passed over to IOM, and I returned home. Okay, I mentioned earlier that my participation in Operation Parasol and this entire Kosovar evacuation program had a major effect on my life. I had worked with Citizenship and Immigration as a desk officer, never in the field. All I had done was review immigration medical exams, the chest x-rays, and the blood work and urinalysis. And I'd never had interaction with either the immigration officers or with the applicant themselves. So it was an eye-opener to me to be there and to actually meet and greet and be involved with an actual person who I can say was at the beginning of or at the end of the movement here. I was struck by, when I was working with the immigration officers, struck by their professionalism, their teamwork, and their willingness to put up with work the long hours that were required to the work they did. One of our speakers this morning mentioned visiting someone, taking them away from their job and having the officer rush back to the office at 8 o'clock to finish up. That was not unusual. Everyone was working until at least 8 o'clock at night. They were good 12-hour days and often longer than that. I was also, as I say, first time I'd ever met someone who was being forced from their home by conflict, and learning about their experiences of being forced from their home, having to travel across a border into a neighboring country, and for the most part, ending up in a refugee camp. This opened my eyes to an understanding and appreciation of what refugee status actually meant, and led to a major change in my personal and professional life trajectory. The event so influenced me that I decided I applied through Citizenship and Immigration for a full-time permanent job in the hope that I could once again become part of a refugee program. Luckily, this turned out for me, and I worked as a medical officer for the next 10 years. Oops, I think next 10 years in Ottawa, in Austria, and in Singapore. This last posting in Singapore allowed me the opportunity to work with the Karen refugees from from Nepal, Thailand, the Rohingyas from Bangladesh, and the Nepali Bhutanese in Nepal. These programs were by far my favorite part of the program and the work that I did, because I felt much more connected and aware of my decisions and what they meant to these people who had been living in refugee camps and whose lives had been so disrupted and who so much wanted to come to Canada. In conclusion, then, I can say that Operation Parasol was an incredible experience, and I think anyone who ever does a field operation will say that it was perhaps the highlight of their career. And it led to me working with more refugees, as was what I wanted to do after Operation Parasol, and it was a wonderful way to end my medical career. Thank you.
Thanks, Marilynn. Right on time. Up next is Martin's up next. Okay, they decided on the order. Martin Barry, who I met while I was in Skopje. My memorable time with Martin was going to a dinner in a cave with Sven Robinson, although he spent most of the time outside on his phone. So, Martin?
Thank you. Yeah, first, I definitely want to emphasize what Marilynn was saying about the experience. It was a highlight of my career as an immigration officer, and it's interesting because when you deal with resettlement of refugees, it's kind of a specialized skill in the department, and in fact, we've learned from this experience, and we've started training more people, but at the time of the evacuation, we had to pull resources very quickly from all over, from headquarters, but also from offices overseas, as we did later on for Operation Syrian Refugees, in fact. And so I was able to work. It was really a privilege to go to Skopje for 6 weeks. So I worked on Operation Parasol, but also on the family reunification. So I'll try to cover that in 10 minutes, and yeah, do my best. And thank you to Crenary again and her team for inviting me, because it's yeah, again, a good event, a good episode of my career to reflect on. So just to pick where Dr. Van Kessel had stopped, we had a mandate. It was clear we had to make a difference with Operation Parasol, 5,000 people, and we had to move them quickly. I mean, the situation was urgent. There was always this risk that the border was closed and stop preventing people from entering, the refugees from entering Macedonia. So Canada had a bold approach. I think we had the largest chartered flight actually leaving, which is 264 seats. And we decided to fly every day. So within 20 days, more or less, we would have our 5,000 evacuees. So as many of you know, like one flight to Trenton, the other one to Greenwood. And so the alternates every day. And so we had an officer who had been working with UNHCR on the registration of refugees since early April. So by the time the flight started to Canada, because initially, like we had offered 5,000, UNHCR wanted to concentrate on Europe. So finally, we were asked to pitch in with Americans and Australians by early May. Well, in fact, 30th of April. So within three days, we were ready to roll. I was pulled from Delhi, New Delhi. I was actually camping in the mountains, so they couldn't even reach me. I didn't have a phone or anything. So by the time I arrived, I was on the third flight and arriving on at the camp, because we were working, the priority was people in camps, so Stankovets 1 and 2. So arriving and the bus was just being loaded. And the emotion this wave of emotion of people departing, and with people they were leaving behind the camp, it's as if it was a second separation after leaving everything behind in Kosovo, and they had started almost like a new village life in the camp, and then suddenly they had to part from all these people again. So it was very emotional, but no time for emotions. We had to work. So we had lists of evacuees based on priorities that UNHCR had set up. So the most vulnerable people, like families with pregnant women and large families with children. And we apply the definitions because we were told to try not to separate families. That's one of the main goals. Now, we had a very broad definition of family. So if people were in the camp with their cousins or uncles or aunts, by all means, we wanted to move all these people together. That was an advantage on some European countries where they had a very strict definition of what family was. It was like parents, children, that's it. So people were left behind with some of these other flights. So anyway, we were working on these lists, and they were posted the day before, and people were called to come to the Canadian tent so we could actually see if they were interested to go, because it was all on a voluntary basis, obviously. And from there, asking a couple basic questions on family composition. Is anybody left behind or missing they don't know about, so we could track later on if they could join on a later flight, if they would arrive later. If they were, and I mean, it was not a perfect system, so some people were actually selected to go to 2 different countries. So it was like, well, the first flight I can get out of the camp, that's the one I'll take. So we had to sometimes negotiate with some other countries, because it was not a unilateral thing. So if somebody was selected to go with Canada and somewhere else, it was up to the person to decide where they wanted to go. As Dr. Percival mentioned, the whole issue of background checks was not covered much. I mean, we had an informal discussion with a person, the kind of occupation they had before they reached the camp, but I mean, there was no real time to dig into potential connection with organized crime or anything like that. Once the list was set up, and we had no shows. That was almost inevitable, that some people had already left the camp, or they were not interested in going, or they hadn't seen the poster. So we spent a fairly good amount of time in the camp also to locate or try to locate people who were on the list but we couldn't reach. So at the end of the day, we could establish lists. And it was really a puzzle, because again, you had these big family groups to accommodate. And the first flight, I think we ended up with 248. So it was pretty spot on. Some flights were more difficult initially. One of the things we had to face is that people didn't want to go necessarily to Canada, and they didn't have an option to decide, I want to go to this place or this other. And so Canada was far. They wanted to be able to return as soon as they could. Could they do it from Canada? So there was this fear. But the more I mean, as the days progressed, we obviously, people had stayed longer in the camp. They could see the movement that was starting. We were making room for more people to come. So eventually people decided to board the plane. So we ended up with flights with 275. So you say, well, you had 264 seats. So children under 2 were actually able to travel on the lap of their parents. So they were not counted. But you can imagine when you have like 10 kids in addition, 11 in addition to, so that was pretty amazing. But we did end up in 23 days. I think the last flight was delayed a little bit. There was a technical issue. So we did 19 in a row, and then a couple of days later, we finished with 235, I think, for a total of 5,051 who were evacuated, which was pretty quickly because the other countries kept going until I think the 28th of May, yeah, when the last flights left. There were about 20 countries who contribute, and overall, because we were doing it with IOM, International Organization for Migration, and so about 60,000 people were resettled with the help of IOM from these camps, and an additional 30,000 were actually moved out through bilateral agreements, so not necessarily through IOM. So that was pretty impressive. And so we would post the flight manifest the day before the flight with a standby list, so if people could not board or had a change of mind, we could fill with other people. So that was pretty military, but we accomplished what we had to. And then the next day, there was like people had, I don't know if anybody can remember, because there was like during the bus ride to the airport, like brochures in Albanian to figure what to I don't know if people have seen, but anyway, to see what life in Canada would be, and a bit of discussion by the IOM people on the bus, like, okay, here's how you could try to find a job in Canada, how we're going to help you with these kind of practical things. And again, on the plane to Canada, there was a video that one of our colleagues had developed. She had prepared on her own to explain to people what are the procedures when you arrive at the airport, kind of reassuring people, refugees typically, who don't know what to expect when they arrive. So, and then we would report to headquarters immediately, like, okay, here's the flight, this is where it goes, how many people, medical emergencies, is anybody escorted by a medical, officer? It did happen a couple of times. So that was the essence of Operation Parasol from a very operational perspective. Family reunification, or the resettlement program, was a bit different, a different pace. Minister Robillard had made a call, and I don't know if it's covered by the panels this afternoon, but in a nutshell, there was a call made to Canadians to see the interest of sponsoring Kosovars through the evacuation, but also the family reunification process. And that was very successful. A bit like later on with the Syrians, when you had this child on the beach, which captured Canadians' attention. It was the same with these trains filled with people forced at gunpoint to leave. And I think it has a strong effect on the Canadian population to respond. So they had over 1,700, I think, sponsoring groups of different kinds who joined, who expressed an interest. These people were not necessarily in the camp or in the 2 camps near Skopje. So there was a huge camp near Gostivar called Cegrani, which was designed for 3,000 people. They had 40,000 people in there. So we were trying to find someone, and relatives in Canada had filled out a relative identification form saying, well, this is my relative. This is where I think these people are. So it was kind of a challenge to go around Macedonia, which was definitely not the same kind of challenges that you had in Albania. But still, I mean, there were roadblocks by the Macedonian police. They had concerns about changing the ratio of the ethnic ratio of some of these communities. So they were really controlling, I would say. I was traveling with an Albanian interpreter, Albanian Kosovar interpreter, so with temporary status in Macedonia. And one day we ran into trouble where they wanted to detain him. So we had to use a System D, and I don't ever know if there was a sort of a payment made without my knowledge by the driver, who was a Macedonian Albanian. But anyway, we took advantage of a phone call by the police officer who was handling us to kind of gently move away, and took the car and went back to Skopje and with our interpreter. So the family reunification was kind of thorough. That was the typical interviews we do when we resettle refugees. So we would go through the claim for asylum, although that was not too difficult to establish. More about family composition again, and background checks, and full medical. So all these steps took longer. Obviously, people took longer to leave, and they were leaving through commercial flights with the help of IOM. So yeah, about 2,700, I think, ended up going to Canada from Macedonia and Albania. So that was the essence of these two programs. And I mean, it definitely had a major impact on my career. I ended up managing offices with big resettlement programs like Singapore and Nairobi at the end of my career. So that was really something. But overall, I think, yeah, the department learned about sort of expanding on training of resources. And we took some lessons from that for Operation Syrian Refugees. I mean, although it was a full resettlement program, so no more an evacuation type of thing. People were resettling to Canada. So our minister, McCallum at the time, had really grand ideas about moving 25,000 people in 30 days in a totally different context, where we had Al-Qaeda and Daesh and all these concerns. So, and exit permits from Lebanon, which were a real pain. And I'm not sure how it came out from Jordan or Turkey. I think Turkey was much more accommodating, but all this to say that we finally convinced the minister that 3 months was a much more reasonable period. And so again, we ended up doing quite well with this program as well. Okay, I'll leave it to Stéphane, I think, for Albania. Merci tout le monde.
I think we were all affected by people we met in the camps or that we were working with. And Marilynn and I we had a couple of interpreters working with the Fit to Fly. And I remember our favorite interpreter was, I think, on the 4th last flight to Canada. And we just shed a few tears about him leaving us. He very quickly learned the patter of taking a bit of history, and he would chatter away in Albanian to an elderly woman, and then turn to the two of us and say, she's got no history of hypertension, she's got no heart disease, she's got no diabetes. And we think, well, what are we going to ask now? So we've got plenty of time for questions. I'm going to take a seat over there, and we'll let the mic handers out decide who's going to talk, and we'll go.
Okay, great. Just before you start, I thought I'd just get the ball rolling with the questions, but it'll be right over. I wanted to ask about the variations and challenges in your operational response to Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian refugees. Were there any variations? And I asked that with the underlying assumption that there were common misperceptions about these communities, specifically that they could not be refugees because of nomadism. Thank you.
In Albania, we met some of those members of that community, but for us, it was not making any difference. I would meet them. At the beginning in Albania, our focus was on family reunification, and which presents its own sets of challenges, right? many of those people who are family members do not necessarily want to go to Canada. You know, they think that the war will be over next week, and they say, I'm not ready to go. And then we started to see, well, we started to process what we would call refugee in the classical sense, that necessarily don't have family in Canada, but are because of activities in the past, if their family have been threatened in Kosovo, they would meet those standards, and then off you go. And this is where our definitions stop. We would have, for me, it was not making any difference, right? To be honest with you, I don't know the numbers of people that have processed who were Kosovar or Roma or anything like that. For me, there was absolutely no distinction. Actually, if they were meeting the definition that we had, which were quite simple, that's it.
Yeah, the same here. And I don't even recall if we had, there may have been in the amount of people that we evacuated, but frankly, and I was not familiar enough, I guess, with Roma names to figure if they were Romas or Kosovars. But again, whoever was selected to go would go, basically. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Megan, and my question is for all of the panelists. We've spoken a lot about the physical health considerations. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the mental health considerations and what mental health supports were available for Kosovar refugees at the time, and mental health supports for staff as well. Thank you.
Okay, for the first part, we were encountering a numbers of cases in Albania, and I'm not too sure if the same thing in Macedonia, who had been victims of torture. Could be mental torture, physical torture, and quickly the good folks in Canada told us, listen, there's a center near Vancouver that specializes in treatment of victims of torture. So a numbers of and that was taken into consideration when we were making the case. It says, okay, if this is a case that really presents some trauma that would meet certain standards, we would direct them to go to Vancouver. In terms of staff, I mean, when we came back from Albania and also Macedonia, the department put at our disposal counseling. And I remember some of colleagues saying, I don't need counseling, I've done this before. And then later on, they would find that perhaps they would, even if it's just to have a conversation about what they went through, can be quite helpful. I mean, it's not like lying on a couch in a psychiatric ward, and it's not like that. The counseling is just to, okay, talk about your experience, how you feel about it, etc. And just that can be helpful. And I have to say that the department has been very, very useful in this and generous.
I would say 25 years ago, though, the focus was not as thorough as it is now. And so I would say, like, most of the time it was the manager who would notice the effect of some of these interviews on people. Again, like, and so what we call vicarious effect now, and like the department has developed a lot of training on this. And when I compare the experience in Macedonia with Operation Syrian refugees, there's a huge difference. With OSR, I mean, I was director at the time, and we had to pull a couple of officers, frankly, who had volunteered repeatedly, had been like 3 or 4 times back, and you could see the toll on them in different ways. So we had to and some of the, I'm thinking of one officer who was really, who could not understand, he didn't see it. He was ready to go on, like, yeah, I don't need this, but we took it was better for him to be removed from the operation. I didn't, I mean, typically what would happen is to cut short an assignment Like you could see the person was not fit for this kind of work. It's intense and it's you're on the adrenaline, so you don't realize that some of these interviews can really transform you. And once in Canada, yeah, you would be referred, but it was kind of on a voluntary basis. So whatever happens later on, I mean, some people probably live with sequels, I would think. So I think the department has learned it's much more. We had the evacuation was nonstop. It was like 7 days a week until the last flight. So no weekend, no nothing. I mean, you just keep going. And initially we were filling those ministers' permits until midnight, I think, like a couple of flights. And then we realized, why are we doing this administrative thing? That it can be done quietly in Canada by the militaries who will be organized and have the time to. And a lot of these questions, I mean, we had to leave blank because we knew so little about these people we were evacuating. So yeah, I mean, it was definitely a different world 25 years ago, I would think, in that respect.
With
Hi.
respect to the mental health of the refugees, I know that the camps, the ones that had a lot of NGOs in them, I don't know specifically that they had psychiatric or psychological counseling, but they did have a lot of medical people who were probably there to talk to people, to listen to them. I felt badly for the refugees that were part of the family reunification program because they were in the local community. There was not always the welcoming atmosphere that you might see in the refugee camp, as much as you think, oh, refugee camp is not welcoming, but you did have services and people willing to provide them to you. So the refugees in the communities had, I think, a more difficult time in many ways than those in the camps, regarding they had no one to go to other than their family that they were staying with or the friends that they were staying with. With regard to the immigration staff, I have to laugh because I came in probably a week after the immigration people were had set up their office in a huge suite on the top floor of the Prince Alexander Hotel. One of the officers was living in the bedroom, or that was his place, but the hotel room itself, the suite, was set up as an office with several desks, fax machines, a few computers. I'm not even sure if we had that many computers. And most of the time we spent a lot of time sitting on the floor filling in forms because there just wasn't enough room for all of us. But my first reaction when I walked into the room and spent some time looking and talking with them was, these people they've been working too hard. They really need a break already, and they'd only been there a week or two, perhaps. And I said to the program manager who was there at the time, I don't remember which one it was because I went through a lot of them, I would recommend that you might want to consider not doing a 6-week temporary duty, but to limit it to 3 weeks, because this is really tough on these. I can see it already in the short time. I don't know if they ever went along with that because Martin mentioned 6 weeks stay. But the only person who didn't get that recommendation was myself, and I was there for about 4 months. But I was not dealing directly with the people going out into the community or into the camps that much. I was sitting at a hospital most of the time doing my routine medical work. And yes, I did talk with them, but I wasn't the one doing the medical examinations. I would go to them at the end of my assessment of their status and tell them what the results were, but that was more limited. It was perhaps a little bit more intense in the refugee camps when we did Operation Parasol, but it didn't have a terrible effect on me because it was such a positive event and most of the people were just so happy to get on the planes.
Just to add, we may hear more about this afternoon, but one of the contributions with Health Canada, we had a psychologist as part of our planning group. One of the contributions was to ensure that there was psychological support in the reception centers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leonora Abdullahu. I am a Kosovar Canadian and 5 years old at the time of our migration. So thank you all for the very pivotal role you played in my family and many of the family's journeys. My question is around some of the pre-refugee camp transitory checkpoints that we went through, or for anyone else in the room that may have an answer. I'm speaking specifically to the border of Northern Macedonia with Kosovo. Specifically, we went through a town called Blotza, which is right at the border. Can you speak to what the governing organizations were in these temporary camps and how you interacted with them, whether there was coordination, because they made the refugee camps at Stankovic look like a haven compared to the conditions that we went through at those checkpoints. And I was lucky to only be there overnight with my family, but I know some families stayed up to 2 weeks, no tents, no accommodation of any kind. And I was just wondering if Canada had any role in those, or who the governing body was and how that was managed.
Frankly, I was, I guess, too much into the operation in the camp that I was not really involved with liaison with the local authorities. Our external affairs colleagues, global affairs colleagues, were more sort of talking to these guys, and I think also people in UNHCR, if there was any negotiation to have with local authorities. The only echo I had, I think it was Macedonian police, but I mean, they were tough. I mean, and we had lots of accounts from people having gone through traumatizing situations, frankly, and even the documentation, like most people would show up, the only thing they had left was a UNHCR ID type of thing from the camp, and they did not necessarily have their documents destroyed or confiscated by the Serbian authorities. It was also done by Macedonian authorities. So I think a lot of, at least the accounts I received, was that many people were actually as traumatized or almost by Macedonians crossing the border as they had been when they were forced to leave Kosovo. So I can definitely relate to what you're saying, but I must say I'm definitely not the expert to expand.
I'm Ruki Kondai, Dr. Ruki Kondai. I want to speak especially with Stéphane that have worked in Albanian. During Kosovo crisis, I have been coordinator in Prime Minister office covering help desk, working with WHO, Ministry of Health of Italy, and all international organizations that was working in Albania during Kosovo crisis. Did you had the cooperation with the EMG group that was established in Prime Minister office?
Some of my colleagues did.
Yeah.
I did not personally. I think that's a major difference that we can draw between the experience in Macedonia and the experience in Albania. As I recall, in terms of cooperation from the Albanian government was really good. We never had.
There, and when you spoke, make me all the memories of that time. Today, I remember everything what we have done.
Yeah, and as I said, the hospitality of the Albanian people, that they would open their doors for people that didn't know, but they considered us family. And as I mentioned, that kind of created its own set of challenges for us, because we needed to, the people in Canada were telling us, find those people, and they were living in those houses that were kind of difficult to locate. But again, without the cooperation of, and I'm talking from the government, and I'm talking to, the drivers that we had with a couple of drivers, the translators, the Albanian translators, it made our lives a lot, I would say, easier. Okay, yeah. In terms of doing our job. Of course, we mentioned about mental health, but when we do this 7 days a week for about 12, 13 hours, it gets a little bit to your head. Imagine what it means for a family, who, as an Albanian family, who has, a very humble apartment, and they receive a family of 5 Kosovar, and they want to help them, etc.
Even 20 and more.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, I know more.
Yeah.
I have a lot of cases.
Yeah.
That their house had 40 people.
Yeah, it was incredible. Yeah, and it was incredible. So I mean, we went through some stress, but I'm thinking about the Albanian families that receive those Kosovar refugees, what they've been through. Also, when you hear the stories that what the Kosovar went through, it cannot help to affect you. right? But again, just to go back to your question, I think from my perspective, the Albanian people, including the government, the police officers, the drivers, the translators that we dealt with, it was excellent.
Yeah, I want to add something related to mental problem. That time we established regulations for all the doctors and nurses coming for international level. They had to declare license that they have their profession. And was the best one because everyone came to help people, but without licenses, we didn't allow no one to work, especially in the people that had trauma at that time, that needed the special attention to these people. I want to show everyone that 1999 in Albania shows the best virtue for Albanian to Albanian. And this is our best in our life. This I can say with open mind.
Hello, my name's Al-Mustafa, and I have a question for the whole panel, maybe specifically for medical personnel. I was wondering if coming into the situation, did you have any information on refugees who may have experienced sexual violence? Did you have any training on that? What were your experiences? And 25 years on, is there anything you wish could have happened or we could have learned from? Thank you.
Okay. No, I had no knowledge of it. I had no experience in it. I had no training in it. And I don't think that was necessarily something that I needed for the job that I was doing there. No one that I spoke to mentioned anything about it. There was nothing ever came up in the family reunification, and the fitness to fly aspect of the program was totally different. And I hope that the IOM doctors who were doing the fit to fly would have mentioned it to us if they had heard about something like that. So absolutely nothing. I do think or suspect that the camps were able to provide that type of care. I don't know whether anyone here can speak to that, but they had, let's say, a tremendous number of NGOs, many of them medical, and I think they would have been more than willing to assist with that type of problem.
I know in terms of interviewing, it's been long established, or I mean, a way of functioning in immigration Canada that, I mean, if you suspect that you're interviewing a woman and you suspect something like this happened, make sure the person is comfortable. And most of the time, in fact, we would refer this person to a female officer to have that difficult conversation if they want to go that way. I mean, we don't necessarily, we're not trained to be psychologists or anything like this, as into like just immigration officer interviewing. But if sometimes there's a need to talk or discuss some of the reasons why they had to flee, and they refer to their experience, but they're not comfortable. I mean, we definitely refer to a female officer.
Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So, and you have to take into the context of the people we were talking to. I mean, clearly some have been heavily traumatized by the events that affected their lives, and they were fairly economical in terms of providing details of what happened. I mean, you could tell by some of the words they were using that, you know, their houses had been destroyed, a husband has been beaten, etc. But, and this is a judgment that I'm going to make, but I think, you know, the Kosovar, it can be quite conservative in terms of exposing themselves, right? And certainly sexual abuse is not something that they would be readily open to discuss. So could it happen? Yes. Was it mentioned to me or my colleagues? No. But as I mentioned, it's not because it was revealed that it perhaps not existed, either in Kosovo or on the way from Kosovo to Albania. we know that there's risks that this can happen. But I was not expecting people to come to me and say, hey, listen, this is what happened to me and my sister, right? So I'll just leave it at that.
Again, that would have been taken care of or would have happened in the camps if it did. And I'm not sure that they were set up to carry that out. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, the refugees in the camps were not allowed to leave and go to the local hospital. So there was minimal care. So I don't really know specifically that did happen or did not.
Good afternoon. Jerry Maffrey, with the former immigration officer. It's been said that the success of the Canadian movement of refugees from Southeast Asia, starting in the mid-70s, was in part due to the fact that the officers working in very remote refugee camps throughout those countries had a great deal of freedom and latitude. It was obviously the pre-cellular phone era. They had latitude. They weren't being overridden, directed, driven by ministers back in Ottawa or the department, that they had the latitude to improvise to make the thing work. To what extent would you say, and you both talked about the comparisons between Operation Parasol and Operation Syria, to what extent would you say that you were given a pretty free rein yourselves out in the field to do the right thing?
Yeah, definitely. There was more free rein at the time, that's for sure. I wouldn't say it's necessarily bad to have more, because I mean, sometimes if you get the right officers making the right decisions, yeah, it's good that you have this latitude. However, we have seen situations, not talking specifically about these two events, but there have been instances where we found out, and not necessarily immediately, that some decisions were really questionable, let's say, either positive or negative. And so there was a need to have a more hands-on approach, for lack of a better say, to actually look at what was going on. Definitely Operation Syrian Refugees, we had to train a lot of people because it was like hundreds of officers on a roster going back and forth and interviewing. And there was a sense that we had to do more spot checking of interview notes and figure what was happening, and almost like this feedback loop that, and that was much easier because by that time, like everything was electronic and available. I mean, we had changed the processing system by the time of Operation Syrian Refugees, so we could see, and that sure enough, there's more monitoring from headquarters than they're used to. That's for sure. But yeah, there are pros and cons with that.
Martin touched a very important point. If you have the right people at the right time at the right place, this question of having Big Brother in Ottawa watching what you do is not really necessary. We were lucky in Albania, despite the challenges. I had the opportunity to work with some very experienced officers, okay, who had seen a lot of things in their career. So what was happening? I mean, we would be working, I would leave with the driver at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. I would come back maybe 4, 5, 6 o'clock at night. We would close the office, then we would go out for dinner. And then the discussion would be about the cases that I, Dennis, or Michel had been encountering. And if you had any doubts, we would be, over dinner and after dinner, talking about those cases that we thought were a little bit, did they meet the threshold? The credibility of the individual. And we had those very fruitful discussions among us that was really helping us collectively to do, in my opinion, the right decisions, right? And I think the people in Ottawa recognize that, because I have to say, in terms of support, whatever we needed, we got. And they, thankfully, didn't start to mingle in terms of our decision-making process or questioning our decisions. They knew full well that us, Macedonia and Albania, we were going through a tough time. The last thing we needed is to have Jerry telling me, Stéphane, I saw this guy that you accepted. Well, are you sure? But that's the last thing what we needed, and they recognize that. So, and I think maybe it's part of the reason of the success of this movement, in my opinion.
Well, thank you very much. We really are out of time. We're running into lunch, and there'll be lots of opportunity at lunch to question our panelists further. I'd like to thank Marilynn, Martin, and Stéphane for their interesting insights and history.
I'd like to reiterate that thanks. I know last night we recognized the veterans, but I really do think it's worth recognizing the immigration officials and doctors who went overseas at great personal cost as well. So thank you again.